Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Kathryn Garforth from Garforth Education, and this is the Right to Read initiative. Today, I'm joined by Lynn Givens from Connect to Comprehension, and we're going to be discussing the recommendations from the Ontario Human Rights Commission Right to Read Public Inquiry and how they relate to reading comprehension. Now, in the recommendations, there's a lot of mention about the science of reading and structured literacy, and a lot of conversations that have been happening around these are directed towards phonics and phonological or phonemic awareness. But it's important people realize that that's not all structured literacy and the science of reading is about. There are 5 pillars that it's based on. It is phonological awareness, phonics, vocabulary, fluency, and comprehension. And we need to make sure that all of these elements are part of our instructions for students across the grade levels. So thank you for joining me today, Lynn. I was wondering if you could give us a little bit of information about who you are and what you do.
Okay, I'm Lynn Givens. I have been a teacher of struggling readers and their teachers for 45 years. I started out as a special education teacher. I taught at the Skank School in Atlanta, which is a school for dyslexic children, and that's where I received my Orton Gillingham training. I was lucky enough to work as the Director of Intervention at the Florida Center for Reading Research with Dr. Joseph Torgeson, who, if you've read anything about phonemic awareness and phonological awareness, his name has cropped up over and over and over again. If you have time, you should go back and read several of his reports that he wrote probably 30 years ago. The most famous is Catch Them Before They Fall. And this is before anybody really started talking about phonological awareness. But Joe was way ahead of the time and talked about how we have to work with our struggling readers before they fall. We have to catch them early. And people now are talking about that, about early screening and early intervention. Well, Dr. Torgeson was talking about that a long time ago. So if you go back and read Catch Them Before They Fall, it's a wonderful thing to read. So I worked with him. I then went on to teach the foundational reading courses at Florida State University, and retired from that several years ago and have been working with my intervention program called Connect to Comprehension, and the connecting site, professional development site, the Center for Literacy Learning. And that has taken up a lot of my time. We Connect to Comprehension just reached its 40th state this week when we were invited to participate in a summer school program with the Ak-Chin Indian community in Arizona. So Arizona became our 40th state. That's what I do right now. And I think, Kathryn, what you said about the 5 pillars, we call them here the 5 components of reading, is so important. And what I think we need to realize is that we don't just do one of these and then do the other one and then do the other one and then do the other one and then do the other one. We don't want to wait to teach comprehension until kids have mastered phonological awareness and phonics. Because if we do that, then we're climbing that mountain and then we have to climb another mountain. So we need to do all of those at the same time. And I know, Kathryn, you and I have talked a lot about that we can begin to involve students with vocabulary and comprehension even before they are reading through the use of interactive read-alouds, which is so important. It doesn't just mean we're reading aloud to students. It means that we're reading aloud and interacting with them. We're asking them questions. We're pointing out vocabulary words. We're building all of those skills, maybe even before students can read. And this is not just for young children, but this is for our struggling readers, our dyslexic students, who really need that guidance, but they may not be reading at a level where they can get those vocabulary words and they can get those comprehension skills. So using those interactive read-alouds is critical. Exciting. 10 to go.
Well, first, I want to say congratulations on the 40 states. That's amazing. Yeah. And then the whole world.
Yeah.
Because, we definitely need to make sure that students get the support they need to read. On top of the 5 pillars, there's some key concepts relating to reading that not everyone's familiar with. And it's looking at how, the end goal of reading, like when we talk about reading, we're really talking about the ability to read, comprehend, and learn from materials. And that's our goal as educators when we're teaching children to read. We don't want them to be word callers and just read words and not understand what they mean. We don't want them to be able to just take information from the surface level. We want them to become critical consumers. And we look at some of those founding theories. I consider like the simple view of reading the basic one to start at. And that's looking at the 2 components that make up reading comprehension. The first is word recognition. And that's the ability for the student to read a word. And that is separate from their language comprehension. And that's their ability to understand the spoken language. Now, they can be strong or weak in both of these, but we need to build the skills so that they can do well in both and have good, adequate reading comprehension.
Yes, exactly. And so building those language skills is what we were talking about just a few minutes ago with that interactive read aloud. That's where you're building those language skills and strengthening those while you're also working on the decoding skills at the same time. Yes. So both strands of that simple view of reading, or if you want to talk about the reading rope, same idea that you have to build decoding and language skills at the same time to get to fluent reading. But I think we need to look at those 5 pillars or 5 components as a puzzle, and we need to have all of the pieces of the puzzle put together. But we don't need to put in one piece and then put in another piece and then put in another piece. We need to make our puzzle all at the same time, so that we're working on fluency, and we can do that with our interactive read alouds. We can certainly do it with decodable text, and that's really, really important for our struggling readers. If we use the right decodable text, we can work on vocabulary and comprehension and fluency while we're working on the decoding skills at the same time. So a shout out here to High Noon Readers, which we use in the Connected Comprehension program, because those readers have vocabulary words that are really solid tier 2 words that students need to know, that are useful and appear in a lot of written text. And we have the opportunity to work on upper level comprehension skills so that we can teach students to compare and contrast and think about cause and effect, and think about inferencing, and even think about figurative language while they're working on decoding. So there's so much talk here in the United States. I don't know if it's so much in Canada, but in the United States, everybody's talking about decodable text. And that's music to my ears that finally, people are moving away from level text and really starting to understand the value of decodable text.
Definitely.
And for people who don't know what decodable text is, those are texts that, let's say you're just a student who's just able to read words with the short vowels, CVC pattern. So 3-letter words, short A, short E, short I. If you have a decodable text, the decodable text will just have those words along with a few high frequency words. And so you won't be expected to read words with other patterns. Well, a lot of decodable texts are the cat sat on the mat, the cat is fat, the mat is flat, the mat is tan. There's not much you can do with that. And so when we're choosing decodable text, it's really important to choose text that gives us the opportunity to teach the language part of the reading rope that you were talking about, Kathryn. And so choose decodable text carefully, because we really want them to give us the opportunity to teach those other parts, those other reading components at the same time that we're working on decoding.
Definitely. And I know a lot of the presentations and the webinars that I'm seeing out there are the ones that they're focusing on the decoding side of things, yes, and the word recognition side of things. And while that is an essential component, especially for those dyslexic students, we do need to make sure the comprehension piece is still there and the vocabulary piece, because another problem that we see is the Matthew effect. And that's where the kids that are reading independently higher level texts get this huge increase in their ability and their comprehension and the vocabulary because of exposure to print. But our students that don't have that exposure don't have the same increase in skills and knowledge.
Exactly. And the other part of that, Kathryn, is that many of our dyslexic students, our struggling readers, are certainly smart. Of course they are. Because we're not talking, this has nothing to do with intelligence. But many of our struggling readers have decreased vocabulary because they haven't been able to read those texts that expose them to really good tier 2 words. So in addition to having gaps in decoding and comprehension because they haven't been able to access text, they also have gaps in vocabulary. And so we need to take that into consideration as we're working with these students. That we may think because they're smart that they know a lot of words, but they may not, because they haven't had the opportunity to read those in text like their more fluent peers. So that's another part of the Matthew effect that you're talking about, the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. Not just in terms of overall reading, but I think it's really important to focus on the gaps in vocabulary that we encounter with many of these kids. So that even when they're able to read, they still may not do very well because they're reading words that they don't know the meanings of. So, you can't get to comprehension if you're reading and every third word or every fifth word or even every 10th word is a word that you don't know. Your comprehension is really going to be affected. So that's a really important component, vocabulary, and we really need to spend a lot of time on vocabulary with our struggling students.
Yes, and I think an important thing that a lot of us don't think about is where we're getting these rich vocabulary words. Everyday conversations around the table, in the playground, even in class, don't typically contain a lot of those vocabulary words that you want. And when we're watching movies and television shows, playing games on interacting at that level, we're not having that rich vocabulary that's needed in the written work because our imaginations aren't having the same demand and we're not trying to understand the same concepts. So if you're watching a television show, you see everything that's around you. So you're not getting those same descriptive words for the setting. And You can see how the characters are interacting. So you're not getting those same vocabulary words about emotion and expression and how things are happening. So when you have a student who doesn't read and is depending on their vocabulary development to happen in real time away from the written language, they're really missing a lot of opportunity to gain those words. Now, something that you've been talking about is tier 2 words. Can you take a moment to discuss those different tiers of vocabulary words for listeners?
Sure. And this is coming from Isabel Beck, who wrote the most wonderful vocabulary book, Bringing Words to Life. And if you are interested in learning how to teach vocabulary, this is where you need to start. It's where you need to start, and it can be where you finish because it tells you pretty much everything you need to know about choosing the words to teach and how to teach them. So according to Dr. Beck, there are 3 tiers of words. Tier 1 words are just everyday words like chair, that all of our English speaking students would know. Now, our ELL students may not know these, and if they don't, that's where we need to start with our English language learners. But for the most part, tier 1 words are everyday words that our students would know. Let me jump to tier 3 before I talk about tier 2. Tier 3 words are content area words, words that you get in science class, in history class, that you don't see on a regular basis in written language unless you're in a specific domain. So what do we have left? We have tier 1, words like chair, and tier 3, words like photosynthesis. And all the words that are left are those important words that we see. They're useful words. They have deep levels. They have many different contexts a lot of times, and we see them, they come up over and over and over again in written text. So those are the words we need to focus on. It's not an exact science. Choosing those words is not an exact science. So Kathryn, if you and I were to read a page of a book and pick out our tier 2 words, they might differ a little bit. So it's not an exact science, but there are a lot of things you need to consider, like is this just a word that we can touch on very briefly and move on? That's a tier 2 word, but it doesn't need the kind of discussion and practice that we would give to words that students are going to see over and over that are rich in meaning. So it takes some practice to be able to do this. And if you are interested, anybody who's listening and interested should check out Isabel Beck's Bringing Words to Life, and that will give you that. When I read that book, my head almost exploded. It was like 1,000 light bulbs going off because I didn't know any of this when I started to read, and I was doing vocabulary instruction very haphazardly. And you don't need to do that. There is a way to do this that is very structured. But it's not just teaching students the definition of these words. It's teaching them the different contexts. It's teaching them the way that they can use these words in lots of different contexts. It's applying these words both to literature and to everyday life, to their lives. So I just can't stress the importance of vocabulary enough. It's critical. It's critical.
Yes, and vocabulary instruction, or when you're reading, kids pick up meaning through context. No, we're not asking kids to read and guess words based on context for identification, but for meaning. When you're looking at a word, like a very descriptive sentence that has lots of adjectives, and you see some words that are synonymous, then you can kind of infer the meaning. And, the more exposures you get to that word in different contexts, it's going to broaden your idea of the meaning and the definition. And we're not wanting educators to create a flashcard deck of words that have come up in reading and just have the definition and then drill them, because that's not an effective strategy for getting students to really understand the word. They may memorize the word and the definition on the back and have a couple sentences that they go to, but they won't have a true understanding of the word and how to use it in real life.
Exactly. And another thing that Dr. Beck talks about is when you talk about, they do need a definition, but it should be a student-friendly definition. If we rely on dictionary definitions, many times if we ask students to write the word on a card and write a dictionary definition, the students don't understand the definition that they've written down, because there are words in the dictionary definition that they don't understand. So it's compounding the problem. So helping students come up with a student-friendly definition is really important. A definition of the basic meaning of a word in terms that they understand and that they can relate to. So that's another point that Dr. Beck makes in her book, and I absolutely agree that they need a basic understanding of the word, but it needs to be in terms that they understand, in terms that are relevant to them. So you may have different definitions for students based on their age level, based on their skill level, based on their basic word knowledge, based on all of those things. Your student-friendly definition may change. It may be narrower for younger students, broader for older students. But student-friendly is the key.
Definitely. And I do want to mention, for those of you listening, if you're listening to a recorded version of this, in the show notes, we will have links to the various resources and books that Lynn and I have been discussing throughout this conversation. If you're listening live, just go back to the replay once it's available, and you will be able to see links to these resources, because they are definitely some valuable ones to check out.
One of the things that I'm thinking you're going to post, Kathryn, also is an example of an interactive read aloud.
Yes, well, I'm hoping that we're moving the conversation there. I just want to cover a couple key concepts before we go do a deep dive into interactive reader aloud, because those are very important. But the next thing I wanted to talk about is the importance of fluency, reading fluency when it comes to comprehension. And fluent reading allows us to have students beyond the point where their focus is the word recognition. We want them to be able to read fluently as if they were speaking, with the right prosody and expression of the text, so they can start to take meaning from what they are reading, and not just reading it like in a monotone, how an old text reader would read it, right? We want it to have meaning, and for them to be paying attention to the punctuation within the text, and be at the point where they can be like, that didn't quite sound right. Let's go back and reread it. Once they're at a fluent level, then we can really focus more on the comprehension. And the reason why this is important is because it lessens the demand on working memory. Now, working memory is a memory that you're using when you're trying to take and understand what you're reading, and it has a limited capacity. So if you are focusing on decoding the word and the word recognition, you're not going to have the space in the working memory to relate that word to the other words that you've been reading and the context of the text itself. So it's going to impact your comprehension.
Absolutely. And I think that you mentioned two things I think are really important. That I think the two words we need to focus on for beginning fluency are accuracy and automaticity. So we need our students to be able to read whatever words they're reading while we're working on fluency. They need to be able to read them accurately, the single words. And they need to be able to read them automatically. So they're not spending time working on sound by sound. So accuracy and automaticity are the stepping stones to fluency. And so if we build those with single words, and then we build them with phrases, we use fluency phrases in Connect to Comprehension a lot. And teachers have said that step from single words to reading fluency phrases has had the biggest impact on their students' fluency. So taking phrases from the text, you're probably beginning with decodable text if you're working with a struggling reader, taking phrases from the text and putting those on strips or however you want to do it, and letting students read those in meaningful phrases. You would model and then have them echo you until they can do that, so that they can start to see that reading word by word doesn't get you there. You have to read in meaningful phrases. And so we have to model this for our students, and we have to practice. We can do that with the fluency phrases. We can also do it with phrase cued text. We're actually taking the text and marking the phrases. We can put a slash mark after each phrase and have our students read to the slash mark and then read to the next slash mark, and put 2 slash marks for punctuation marks because you pause more there. But that's another way to get students, so that accuracy, automaticity, and reading in meaningful phrases are the building blocks that I think you're talking about, Kathryn, to get our students to be fluent readers. And without fluency, there is very little comprehension because of the working memory that you were talking about.
Yes, definitely. And I think it's one of the things that I like about when you're making the marks on the test. I think of it like a musical score that you're creating.
Yes.
Right. With the lines, and you're saying, okay, well, this is how many words we're reading in this bar. And I find it really helpful because yes, there are the punctuation marks for the students to read, but sometimes they just get jumbled because they're at the bottom of the text.
Many words in between punctuation marks. 2 words, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
So you can break those up into meaningful phrases. And it takes some practice to be able to do that. If you are interested in doing this, and you can just Google phrase cued text.
Yeah.
And there's steps for being able to do this, for you to do it first as a teacher, for you to show students how to do it, for you to model, for students to practice. If they're in a classroom or small group, they can practice in pairs, just so that they get more and more used to reading in meaningful phrases. And eventually, after you've practiced this enough, so your students can go back in first a short passage and then a longer, and do their own phrase cued text. So they can spot where those phrases are and mark them for themselves, so that they are focused on, okay, I need to read in meaningful phrases. This phrase has meaning, so I'm going to put a slash mark here. And when I read, I'm going to read that phrase basically in one breath, is the way you can explain. So you're not reading one word at a time. Okay, you're reading in meaningful phrases, and like I said, without that, there's very little comprehension. So it's really important to teach our students all of those things about fluency.
Yes, and I think a great book for teachers to use during this is the Eat, Shoots, and Leaves children's book.
Yes.
Because it looks at the importance of punctuation and how it changes the meaning of sentences. And it has the same words on pages side by side. So if you have the book open, you can see the sentence twice with different punctuation marks and breaks where they stop. And then it has very neat pictures that show that depending on your phrasing, it's going to change the meaning of the sentence. And I think kids love that. I mean, at least in my experience, they do.
They do. They do. One of their favorites is "Let's eat, comma, grandma," and then
Yeah.
without the comma, "Let's eat, grandma."
Yeah.
Two very different things. Um,
Well, then as an activity, you can get them to create their own.
yes, that's right. That's right. That's another way to have them internalize the importance of punctuation.
Definitely. One thing that we've touched on briefly is the dyslexic student that does have problems with the decoding and the fluency. Now, when that happens, it doesn't mean that they can't comprehend text. And it's very important that we include that comprehension instruction for them and give them access to texts that are at their comprehension level, but not necessarily their reading level. So the best way that I find that we can do this is through the use of audiobooks, because it's going to give them access to those tier 2 words that they're not getting from everyday conversation, but they're still getting the exposure to them from oral text that is read to them. And we can still practice those various comprehension strategies in those situations.
Yes.
Now that we've talked about the blocks that we need, I think it's time to move to that comprehension piece. And there are 2 ways that we want to approach comprehension instruction, in my opinion. One is the oral comprehension, which is definitely something that you've been talking about with the interactive ReadAlouds. And the other is when we want to take it to the student practicing themselves with texts that they are reading, and highlighting the importance of teaching the different levels of comprehension from a young age. We don't want to just focus on the surface level comprehension, which is asking questions that they can go back to the text and take the answer from right away. We want to get them to doing some of those deeper thinking questions right away, especially when we're having conversations and doing those interactive read-alouds.
Yes, exactly. This really was the goal when I started to develop connected comprehension, was to use decodable text and to write from the, like you said, right from the beginning, right when students are just reading 3-letter short vowel words, to begin to get them to make inferences, to get them to compare and contrast, to get them to talk about main ideas, all of those things right from the beginning. Because like you said, we can't wait. And so when they're reading those decodable texts, they're going to have a lot of opportunities to do that. But another way to provide even more opportunity is, like I said, through those interactive read-alouds. And so when you're asking students questions and you're modeling thinking in those interactive read-alouds, you don't want to just stick to literal kinds of comprehension. You don't just want to say, well, now, what color is her shirt? Where did she go? We need to do more whys and hows and do you think, do you agree with? All of those kinds of questions to lead students to go beyond literal comprehension to inferential comprehension, and finally to evaluative comprehension. Do you agree with? What do you think the author's trying to tell you here? We can do that from the very beginning if we model it. If we model that kind of thinking in our interactive read-alouds.
Definitely. Now, before we move on to the interactive read-alouds, can you just go into a little bit more detail about each of those types of comprehensions that you were talking about? just so everybody's clear on the definition.
Talk about the three kinds of comprehension. Okay,
Yes, please.
so there's literal comprehension, which is like you were talking about a few minutes ago, the information that you can find directly in the text. So what color was her shirt, where was she going, what's her mother's name, so on and so forth. So inferential comprehension is more looking for clues in the text to draw your own conclusions. Now, this doesn't mean that you can just wildly guess, because you have to go back and actually prove your thinking by looking, but it means connecting. I guess another way to look at this, it means connecting several parts of the text. Okay? And then we've got evaluative, so things like drawing conclusions, that's inferential. Looking for main ideas, you've got to infer to do that. Comparing and contrasting, those are all inferential skills. And then the final level is evaluative comprehension. Evaluative comprehension is thinking about the author's choice of words, thinking about the author's purpose, what he's trying to get you to think about, those kinds of things where you're actually evaluating the effectiveness of the text. And even young children can do in terms of word choice. Why did the author use this word? Why did he use this word instead of this word? Which one do you think would be better? Those are all evaluative kinds of questions. And we need to really make sure that we don't focus just on literal questions, because if we do that, that's all students are going to be able to answer. So does that help, Kathryn, in terms of the...
Yes, definitely.
Okay.
Definitely. And I really like that you pointed out that young kids can do this.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
They can learn to do this. Even preschoolers, we can teach them these critical thinking skills.
Absolutely.
And it's surprising how much they can pick up and understand if we only ask them to.
Yes. And the other thing we need to remember, especially if we're talking about dyslexic students, many dyslexic students are very, very bright, and their vocabulary may be depressed, but their thinking skills are much higher than would be suggested if we just look at their ability to read text. So we need to make sure that we don't think that a child who is struggling to read is struggling to think.
Definitely.
I think that's really, really important. And so through the interactive ReadAlouds, through the listening to audio text, those kinds of things, we can continue to work at thinking at the student's level and not being tied down to just his decoding ability. Because if we do that, we're sort of putting chains on this child. We don't want to do that. We want them to soar. And if they can't soar, if decoding is a plodding struggle, which it is for many of our dyslexic students, it's a real struggle. It's important to allow them to continue to further their thinking skills, their comprehension skills. And that's important for another reason that we haven't even talked about. We want our dyslexic students to know that they are smart. And if we are only working on the fact that they are struggling with decoding and they are plodding along with decoding, they're not going to think of themselves as smart. But if we work on upper level comprehension skills, if we work on interesting tier 2 words and have really good discussions about vocabulary, we can convince our dyslexic students that they are in fact smart. And a lot of our kids need to hear that, and they need to understand that, and they need to know that in their hearts, that they're smart, they're just having trouble breaking the code. But everything else may really be in place. So that's another reason for the kinds of things that we're talking about here, to be able to work on those upper level comprehension skills.
And we definitely want to help increase the vocabulary so that when they do start decoding those more difficult words, they have the vocabulary to support it, whether it is correct or incorrect.
Exactly. I never thought about that until, I don't know, maybe 7 or 8 years ago. I read a quote by Louisa Moats saying that exact same thing. That if a word is in a child's receptive vocabulary, words that he understands, and he reads it correctly, having that word in his receptive vocabulary, in his vocabulary that he understands, will reinforce the fact that he's read it correctly. So vocabulary and decoding are very closely related in ways I didn't used to think about, but thank you to Dr. Moats, I realize that now, that connection is really important, just like you said.
Yes, of course. All right. So let's move on to those interactive read-alouds. Okay. So can you start out by just explaining what they are to a teacher that may not be familiar with them?
Sure. So this is where you're reading aloud to students. That's the read aloud part. The interactive part is that you're asking them questions while you're reading, and also that you're thinking aloud. So you're modeling the kinds of thinking for students that they should be doing while they're reading. So things like, wow, I wonder why I wonder why the author said that. I'm thinking that the author said that because this character is really sad, and that's why she said that. Or, oh, I'm wondering what this word might mean. Well, it says in the sentence before that the character was sad. So now I'm reading the word, what's a word for sad? Now I'm reading the word...
Devastated.
Devastated. Okay, thank you. I wonder if that has something to do with sad. Oh, I bet it does, because we know the character is sad. So you see the kind of conversation I'm having with myself, and the students are listening. And so you want to choose books for your interactive read-alouds that are engaging to students, where they will want to listen to you, and you want to be excited about the book, and you want students to get excited. Now, it doesn't mean that you're doing this for every sentence, but you're doing it often enough that students start to really understand the kind of thinking that they need to do while they're reading. And Kathryn, you're going to put a sample of an interactive read aloud that I've actually done with students with third graders, using The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which is a fabulous, fabulous book that students get really excited about reading, but it has such wonderful, wonderful vocabulary. Charlotte's Web is another one that the vocabulary is just astonishing. And students really get into listening to that book before they can read it, and they learn some really good comprehension as they're exploring the characters in the story, but they also learn some really good tier 2 vocabulary words that are very rich in meaning. So people who are listening to this, whether live or recording, can go to that, look at this sample, and then feel free to contact me with questions if you have any. Happy to answer them.
Yeah, you are very wonderful about helping everybody understand and really make those connections for those students. And I want to thank you for that, because I know it makes a huge difference.
Well, I'm here to support teachers. And like I said, I've been in this business, not a business, but my mission has been to help struggling readers. So the more I can do of that, the better. Wonderful. A lot of people, some people just waiting for the replay because they can't hear. So, oh well, sorry.
Now, when we're doing these interactive read-alouds, it's like you're modeling what's actually going on in your head. Exactly. So these students get the opportunity to see what a skilled reader should be doing as they're reading the text. And, a great way to do this with some books that, as an adult you can do is looking for annotated copies of texts. because you get those deeper thinking questions and you get those sidebars. And it's almost like, I know that I don't even know if they're published anymore, but like the Coles Notes version to a story,
Right.
right? It's highlighting those key points. And I think it's really important for students who struggle with identifying those key points. And it's not something that we just want to do with fictitious books. It's important to have interactive read alouds with the nonfiction and the textbooks, and also teaching children those note taking strategies and giving them the framework for paragraphs and for nonfiction textbooks so that they understand, the structure and how to get that information out of the sentence. And this gives us, a standing point to go forward.
Absolutely. And so I think even before textbooks, just reading informational text and talking about the 5 different text structures, knowing that a passage is a descriptive kind of paragraph, or that or a chapter, or that a passage is centered around cause and effect, and there are keywords. We could have a whole different discussion about that, but important to get students, like you said, into informational text. Yes, I absolutely agree. But narrative text is your first go-to, so that students get comfortable with the whole idea of thinking aloud and the way that you're doing that. And this another thing that's so important, I have a course on the Center for Literacy Learning that talks about 8 comprehension strategies. And the first strategy that I talk about is self-monitoring. And so students need to not just be on automatic pilot when they're reading. You need to teach them to self-monitor, to read and to constantly be asking themselves, does this make sense? What does this mean? How can I use what I know to add meaning to this? So that's a critical part of all this. And so when you're doing the interactive read aloud, you're really modeling that self-monitoring as you're saying, gee, I wonder what the author means here. Gee, I wonder what that word is. That's teaching that whole critical comprehension strategy of self-monitoring. So if you want to learn more about that, check out the Center for Literacy Learning Comprehension Strategies.
Yeah, and I think we've had conversations about that in the past, so I'll make sure to include the links below in the description.
Good.
For individuals who are interested in learning more, because you are just a wealth of information. And
I've been at this a long time, so a lot longer than
exactly.
these
And
right here show that.
I think we've done a good job today showing that, structured literacy and reading science, or the science of reading, doesn't just have to do with that word identification. It's providing structure so that we can create students who are proficient at reading and giving them the skills to understand, learn, and enjoy texts. When they can do this, they have the ability to not just be stuck in the present and information that's available to them online. There's a quote somewhere, I can't remember the exact thing, but it's saying how when you teach a child to read, you unlock the doors and give them the opportunity to talk to people from many years ago. And you unleash unlimited knowledge.
Yes. True. Absolutely true. Well, Kathryn, I think this has been a good discussion, and I hope it's been helpful for the people who are listening and the people who will listen. So, again, any questions, feel free to email me. I'm happy to get back to you. Bye, Kathryn.
Thank you so much for joining me today. Take care.
You too. Bye.